The Curé of Ars. Chapter 11. The Devil Hits Back. The Abbé Vianney had said in one of his very earliest sermons, if a parish priest doesn't want to be damned, and if there is any loose living in his parish, he must spurn the very thought of public opinion and the fear of being despised or hated by his parishioners, even if he were certain of being lynched when he came down from the pulpit. That must not stop him speaking out against it. The Curé de Ars quite certainly did not want to be damned, and he had no ambition at all to win for himself those purely human sympathies, which are only too often the shabby wages of a tactful truckling to evil. He was out to show sin the door, even were it to draw down upon him the hatred and the thirst for vengeance of those who had given themselves to its past repenting. And that is just what it did bring him. We didn't ask him to come here. That was the praise constantly to be heard on the lips of the drinkers in the cafes, chiming in on the publicans, indignation, venting their fury between potations. Why, there's not a girl in Ars now who's not at church, or safely attached to her mother's apron strings. Let him go back where he came from, the spoil sport. The chorus went on. Why can't he let us drink and dance and enjoy ourselves in peace? But the curé's enemies went further than this. They wove his name into licentious verses, which they sang under his window coming home from their revels. They called him a hypocrite and a humbug. With knowing winks they spread the story that his ascetic pallor was really due to his nights of debauchery. They defiled the door of the presbytery with their dirt. Anonymous letters of an unspeakable character poured in on the ecclesiastical authorities, accusing him of the most loathsome vices. The Bishop of Belley, who had only recently been installed in his diocese, sent over the Curé of Trouville, the Abbé Vianney's superior, to hold an inquiry into his conduct. The unhappy saint had to drink the cup to the dregs. Simultaneously, he was visited by an unsupportable anguish from within. He was beset by the fear that he was not equal to his duties, that he was betraying God's plan. Finally, that he was on the road to damnation. He continued to pray as long and as ardently as ever, but heaven remained silent. The temptation to give up came upon him. He wanted to leave Ars, to shut himself up in a Trappist monastery, never to look on his fellow human beings again. The strength that faith inspires held him back. He schooled himself to the habit of meditating on the passion of our Lord, and of lifting his thoughts to the cross, and at last peace returned to him. He himself told the story of how it happened. You must pray for the grace to love your crosses, he confided to some of his friends. Then they become dear to you. I went through the experience myself for 4 or 5 years. I had to meet with every sort of slander and opposition. I had my crosses then, sure enough. I had almost more than I could carry. I began to pray that I might love my crosses, and I was happy. I ended by saying to myself, really, this is the only happiness there is. It was only a tiny minority, of course, who were responsible for the slanders and the sabotage, but they wounded the Abbé Vianney in most sensitive point in his soul. Allegations that cast aspersions on his priestly honor threatened to bring him into discredit and to paralyze his action for good. Nevertheless, taking his example from Jesus, who was abused and mocked at by his enemies, he did not open his mouth. He contented himself with disclosing the wounds that scarred his heart to God, alone face to face with him in his vigils before the tabernacle. He rose from his knees to go on with his daily duties. You are doing far more for God, he said, when you are doing things although they give you no pleasure or satisfaction. It is possible they may show me the door in the meantime, but I'm going ahead as if I were staying here to the end of my days. The slanders in the end died out of their own. In any case, as Catherine bears witness, the stories told against the Abbe Vianney by malicious and dishonest people never received the least credence among the decent part of the population, with even unbelievers taking his defense. There was no wonder that the Catholics of Ars replied to such tales in words like those of young Antoine Mandy. "You're quite mistaken. I've watched him for a long time myself. Our curé's a saint." He was a saint. That was just what infuriated one irreconcilable enemy of the Curé d'Ars. The others would be converted sooner or later, and would own up to their errors. This one never. For things did not end with human opposition. The angel of darkness had to take a hand. In the ordinary course of events, Satan is too cunning to let himself be seen. His temptations come to most people as a suggestion that crosses the mind here, a whisper there, whose origin not the finest ear could identify. When he comes up against certain souls, however, souls better or more lofty, he realizes he is defeated in advance, and he is seized by a frenzy of rage. Seeing his habitual tricks subsided, he throws his normal tactics to the wind, gives himself up to a wild fury, and testifies by cries, by unearthly noises, even by blows to his invisible presence. For more than 30 years, the Knight of Ars were witness of this impotent fury. When the story began to go around the village and its neighbors' hamlet that the Abbe Vianney was being plagued by the evil one, there were naturally skeptics who argued that if anything were wrong, it was the saint's fasts and vigils that were to blame. The best answer to them is given by two doctors, Doctors Saunier and Michel, who on various occasions had the Curé d'Ars under their professional care and who testified to the perfect equilibrium of his temperament, serenity of outlook, delicacy of perception, soundness of judgment and of opinion, complete self-possession, miraculous health. These are some of the phrases used of him by Dr. Saunier, who treated him in his last 17 years. His colleague speaks of him in almost identical terms. Everything I have seen or heard about the Curé d'Ars, Dr. Michael declared, convinced me that he enjoyed complete possession of himself and of unerring judgment, and nothing could ever make him believe that he was the victim of illusions or hallucinations. As to the attacks of the devil, I have heard talk about them, and if the Abbe Vianney says they took place, I believe they did. Moreover, there were other witnesses of this extraordinary pestering. The Abbe Denis Chaland, who was brought up at Ars as a boy, not only collected statements from the villagers, he had also, as will be seen below, been in a position to form a personal opinion on the matter. He testifies that everyone was persuaded that the noises came from the devil. I never doubted it myself, and neither years nor reflection have changed my conviction on this point. There is no question of any trickery. If any practical joker or people interested in promoting a hoax had been concerned, they would have been very soon unmasked. With his preface, let us come to the facts. When the curé was thinking about the plan of his providence, for which he had just bought a house, he started to hear loud noises at the presbytery. These were the words of Catherine, giving evidence at the canonization process. Thinking that it might be thieves, he spoke to a few young men who kept watch at the presbytery and in the belfry. One night a man named Vircher was mounting guard. Here the story passes to André Vircher, whose own experience began when he arrived at the presbytery with a loaded gun. I talked to the curé and warmed myself up till 10 o'clock. Vircher stated, and finally he said, "Let's go to bed." He gave me his own room and went to the next room But I did not go to sleep. About 1 o'clock I heard a violent shaking of the latch and a handle of the door that gives onto the courtyard. At the same time a shower of cudgel blows rang out, while the presbytery itself was filled with a noise of thunder, like the rumbling of a series of carriages. I took my gun and ran to the window, which I opened. But when I looked out, there was nothing to see. The house trembled for about a quarter of an hour. My legs were in the same state, and I felt the effect for a week after. As soon as the noises began, the curé had lit a lamp and came to me. "Did you hear it?" he asked me. "Of course I heard it. Otherwise I shouldn't have got up and got my gun." The presbytery was shaking as if there had been an earthquake. "Are you afraid of them?" the curé asked me. "No, I'm not afraid, but I can feel my legs giving way," I said. "The presbytery is going to collapse." "What do you think it is?" "I think it's the devil." When the noise finally stopped, we both went back to bed. The Abbé Vianney came to me the following evening and asked me to go back with him. I told him, "Monsieur le curé, I've had enough of it as it is." Following this refusal of the village wheelwright, Antoine Mandy, son of the mayor, and Jean Cotton, gardener at the chateau, mounted guard at the presbytery for a dozen nights or so. They heard blood-curdling noises, nothing more, but they did not see a trace of thieves. When the noises showed no signs of stopping, the Abbé Vianney became convinced that he had to do with something more than mortal malice, and worried no further about guards. He alone was the object of the devil's attacks. It was for him to stand up to them on his own. He soon discovered that these mysterious visitations redoubled in their furiosity if any happy change, any new conversions were taking place in ours. The curé began to be glad of them, almost to take them as a game. He gave the devilish troublemaker a nickname, and would remark, "Old Snatch is in a temper." So much the worse for him. The evil one had a perfectly logical plan in giving vent to his fury as he did. His aim was to wear the Abbé Vianney's resistance down by depriving him of any kind of rest or of sleep, to make his ministry impossible, and to sicken him of his parish. In a word, to get rid of him. But as things turned out, it was he who gave in first and abandoned the field to his adversary. It was only by constancy of heroic quality that the Curé de Ars held his ground against this terrible ordeal, and in 1824 he had given up spending his nights, or rather the few hours of each night that he allowed for his Spartan sleep, in the garret or in the damp ground-floor room. Acute facial neuralgia obliged him to pay a little attention to his health, so he lay down on a mattress in his own room. Hardly had he blown out his candle, however, when the witches' Sabbath would begin. A thunder of blows would threaten to club down the door, and almost immediately the Abbé Vianney would have the sensation that he was there. He knew, without knowing how, that the evil one had penetrated into the quiet room, and though he might remain invisible, apart from very occasional manifestations in the form of clusters of bats, a swarm of bees, or an army of rats, the piercing cries, the bellows, groans, and roars that could be heard spoke clearly enough to his presence. Then the furniture would begin to dance about, and the curtains round the lurching bed seemed on the point of being torn into 1,000 pieces, or the noise would come from the garret, and the floor above the bedroom would sound with the continuous trot of a flock of sheep or of hammering hoofs of a cavalry charge, or an army of men in iron-shod boots would be climbing the stairs. Sometimes the hubbub would stop quite suddenly, and the Abbé Vianney would be on the point of dropping off to sleep, when the whole inferno would begin again, and keep the saint awake till the moment it was time for him to get up. The devil showed no lack of imagination in the variety of his monstrous pranks, although most of the time he acted as if his name, as in the Gospel, was Legion. It would sometimes appear as if there were only a single spirit present. That happened when a harsh singing of extraordinary power would seem to issue from the fireplace, and the Abbe Vianney would comment next day, "Old Snatch has got an extraordinarily ugly voice." Then fingers of an astonishing agility would beat a tattoo on the water pot, or a heavy hammer would seem to be knocking nails into the floor or fixing iron hoops in place round a cask. Again, it might be that the shrill voice that the Curé de Ars could never hear without a shudder would insult him, and the invisible being, in the wildness of its excitement, would at one moment speak from less than arm's breadth, and the next from a mile away. "Ha, ha, Vianney!" The mocking words would ring out. "Not dead yet, ah, Vianney? I'll have you in the end." And from his meager bed the saint, strong in his trust in God, would reply, "I am not afraid of you." There is no question of these cries being imaginary. They were heard by people outside. One of the pieces of evidence on this is that the gendarme Naploy, who thought the curé was in danger and was on the point of going to help him. Another comes from Denis Shandland, who, with some of his friends, was playing truant from the school where he was a boarder. Shandland had glued his ears to the curé's door and had heard the ironic challenge, "Vianney, Vianney," repeated 20 times and more. Marguerite, the curé's sister, had sometimes slept in the so-called guest room. On one of the nights she spent there, she recounted an extraordinarily violent noise started up near my bed, as if 5 or 6 men were hammering with all their might on the table or the chest of drawers. Naturally, she told her brother. "You needn't have been scared, my dear," said the Curé de Ars, reassuring her. "It's only old Snatch. He can't do anything to you. It's just his way of tormenting me. Sometimes he takes me by the feet and drags me into my room. It's because I've been converting souls to God." He made the same kind of reply to Marie Richotier when she asked him about the strange noises she had heard even from her house, far away as it was. "They haven't escaped my notice either," replied the saint with a gentle smile. "It's probably some sinners who are on the way to ours." Time and time again, Abbé Vianney was to show proof of his power over the devil. While exorcists need long prayers to cast out an evil spirit, a simple sign of the cross or a brief order was usually sufficient for it to obey the Curé de Ars. He fought the devil wherever he could find him, but above all in souls where the evil one reigns through the slavery of sin. He pursued him, too, into the darkness where he flees from prying eyes by condemning occultists, spiritualism, and table-turning, all activities which, if they are not outright frauds, fall into the field of forbidden things. The Curé de Ars forbade them then, and as the Church condemns them today. As the years went by, these diabolical visitations became less frequent and less tormenting. In the final months of his life, the Abbé Vianney at last came to know peace. Chapter 12. The Crowds Come to Ars. There were certain singular happenings in his life which the Abbé Vianney always did his best to keep dark. All the same, at moments when affection broke down his reserve, he would relax into a confidence. It was at such a moment that, telling the story of his arrival in the parish on the evening of February 9th, 1818, he admitted, "When I saw Ars for the first time, I said to myself, how small it is. Then quite suddenly the idea occurred to me, there will come a time when this parish will not be able to hold the crowds who visit it." This supernatural presentiment was to come true. A matter of 10 years later, in 1827, the young Countess Laure des Guerets, who went every evening to benediction during the octave of Corpus Christi, wrote to her father, "The church is full of worshippers, among whom were a great number of visitors. The pilgrimage had begun, and it was to gather way continually through up to the Abbe Vianney's death." It may be asked what all these visitors were doing. They were not sightseers in the ordinary sense of the word, or even tourists, a species then comparatively rare. These people really had come on pilgrimage in the hope of seeing a saint, most of them wanting to make their confessions to him and to receive Holy Communion from his hands, for already the whispers were beginning to get about that the Curé d'Ars worked miracles. It was true. To begin with, he had worked a miracle of conversion. The inhabitants of Ars were not only witnesses of his power, but a living proof of it. Other living proofs were to be found in parish after parish round about, which the Abbé Vianney had evangelized in the course of a mission, a series of Lenten sermons, or a jubilee of parish priests of the towns nearby. In the Aisne had one after the other seen for themselves the supernatural power for good of their colleague from Ars. The faithful of these parishes were even more enthusiastic about the Curé d'Ars than their clergy. Many were determined to pay another visit to the man who had shown them the light so clearly and who had given them such penetrating advice, whether from the pulpit or in the confessional. They flocked into the village, and people even came from Écully and Dardilly. So profound was the impression that the Abbé Vianney had left there. From 1827 on, an inhabitant of Ars said, visitors were arriving in the village at the rate of 20 a day. Then the stories of miracles started to spread among the villagers and their guests. The pilgrims would go to the house of Providence to seek the kneading trough where the flour had been miraculously multiplied. Sick people would have mixed with the crowd that surrounded the Abbé Vianney, and there would be talk of improvements and amazing cures which could be due to nothing but his intercession. It was in vain for the saint of God to impose silence on those who found themselves cured after having solicited his prayers. He was much too humble not to become alarmed at the turn in events. While he was still an assistant priest at Écully, he had begun to invoke the aid of the young saint of the catacombs, of whose discovery and whose miracles Pauline Géricault had told of him. Since 1805, there had been no end of the wonders that had taken place in front of the bones of the little martyr, which had been removed from Rome to Naples, and from Naples to Mugnano. It was to this young saint that the Abbé Vianney prayed with most assurance, after the Blessed Virgin. It is true, when he wanted to obtain some favor that had been asked of him, it therefore came quite naturally for him to attribute to Saint Philomena the miraculous events that took place at Ars, and by doing so he hoped he might be left in peace again. The devotion to Saint Philomena was as popular in France as in Italy in the 19th century, and if this unobtrusive star had grown paler in the sky since then, it is because others have risen, which have drawn more attention. But in the time of the Abbé Vianney, and indeed, thanks to him, the Roman martyr was venerated all over France. The Curé d'Ars called her his dear little saint, his consul, his charge d'affaires at the court of God. Hardly a day passed without him talking to her. "You ask her," he would reply when someone asked him for a miracle. He communicated something of the fervor of his confidence to his congregation and to the pilgrims who came to Ars. No sooner was the cult of the little saint authorized by Pope Gregory XVI Then he has hastened to open a chapel dedicated to her at the side of his church. More people went to it than to any other, and it was there that the greatest number of cures took place. It was the saint first of all, however, that the crowds came to see. They may have thought of him as the worker of miracles, but over and above that they sought in him the confessor, the director of consciences, the adviser, and the comforter. From 1829 on, there were very few hours of the day when the Abbé Vianney was able to leave his confessional. All the rest of his time he was the prey, it might almost be said the victim of sinners, though he retained the title of curé and took as keen an interest as ever in the parish he loved so much. It was not until 1843 that the authorities sent him an assistant. He gave himself with both hands to an enormous task of which the whole church enjoyed the fruits. That, then, was to be his vocation for the rest of his life, to shut himself up in a narrow box, to remain seated hour after hour on the rough wooden seat, and to listen once again to the voice that accused themselves of every sin under the sun, then to turn the souls to the light and to call down on them the endless succession, the divine pardon. He could never have remained faithful to this beneficent and terrible vocation had it not been for a special grace which his own indomitable enthusiasm and energy went out to meet. Sometimes this prisoner of sinners would be traversed by a wave of natural revolt. His lungs would cry out for air, his eyes for a sight of the blue sky, all his being for a little freedom and happiness, solitude and rest. He found the strength to submit these more than human moments of rebellion to the orders of Providence. The sinners had come in crowds to find him, and it was for him to chain himself there and wait for the sinners. So they're talking about the confessional box. So the priest sits in kind of like a closet, and the person kneels with a screen between them and confesses their sin. And so they're saying that he would stay in there for hours and hours a day. From 1830 to 1859, a daily average of some 400 travelers arrived at Ars. The distance from Lyons to Ars is no more than 23 miles, but the return ticket of Ars, delivered at Perche station by railway and connecting coach, were valid for a week. The railway administration rightly judged that it would be impossible for a traveler to reach this turn to see the Abbé Vianney and start on his return journey in less than that time. But the railways were not the only carriers involved in the pilgrimage. A whole service of coaches sprang into being round Ars. According to a report prepared in 1855 by the sub-prefect of Trouville, 2 omnibuses were daily plying from Lyons to Ars. 2 others made a connection twice a day with the Paris-Lyons railway, which ran from Villars to Villefranche, made a regular stop at the place of the pilgrimage. And this is taking no account of the private carriages, the travelers who arrived by boat down the Saône, and the scores of pilgrims who, impelled by their devotion or inspired by a spirit of penitence, preferred to come on their feet, however long the road they had to tread. And all this commotion and bustle in the heart of the 19th century, just to fall at the knees of a humble parish priest in an obscure little country parish, 120,000 souls maybe, or 130,000 souls, drawn there every year by a special grace of God. Monsieur le Curé, Catherine once observed naively to the Abbé, other missionaries go out and hunt sinners, even in faraway countries, but with you it's the sinners who do the hunting. And the saint, who could not deny the fact, was forced to reply, there's something in that too. For M. Jean Felix Desgarets, a brother of the mayor of Ars, was speaking no more than the truth when he said that the immense majority of the visitors made their visit at the bidding of faith, devotion, or repentance, and if a few mere sightseers were mingled with the crowd, it was nothing out of the ordinary for the most indifferent to be won to God by a gesture, a look, or a tear of the venerable curé. People of all ages and of every station, Monsieur Descartes went on, were to be found in this multitude, bishops and priests, monks and nuns, nobility and commoners, scholars and illiterates, the former accustomed to discuss the weightiest problems, the latter brought to ours by nothing but the simplicity of their faith. Among the latter, I have seen entire families of peasants arriving in farm carts from provinces as far away as the mountains of Auvergne, merely to see the servant of God and to worship in the Ars church. The crowd was no mob, noisy and bent on its pleasures. The very village of Ars had become a sort of shrine. When those on foot reached the crest of the hill from which the church becomes visible, most of them stopped, and many of them flung themselves on their knees and prayed. In the inside and the upper deck of the clumsy coaches, a sudden silence fell on the men and women, and faces became intent. The whole length of the route there had been only one subject of conversation between the travelers, or rather the pilgrims, the saint. And now they were going to see him, to hear him, and talk to him. Was talk the word? Their hope was to throw their whole soul into his and to receive from his lips the answer that would transform the present and illuminate the future. So there were few indeed whose first concern when they arrived in the village was to book a room. They turned their steps at once to the ascent of the incline that leads to the church, if indeed it was possible to get there. A parish journalist who made the pilgrimage in March of 1859 found visitors standing in great numbers in the old churchyard and even in the adjoining streets, waiting their turn. All he could do was to take his place in the queue and to move forward at snail's pace to step by step before the west door. Many of the pilgrims must have sighed a sigh of relief when at last they entered the church. But their wait was not over yet. The nave, the side chapels, even the choir, everything could be packed. The saint sometimes heard confessions in the chapel of St. John the Baptist, sometimes in the sacristy, sometimes behind the high altar. From time to time his slender form could be seen gliding by, always clad in white, for it was only when he undressed for bed, when he took off the surplice he put on in the morning to go to the confessional. At such moments there would be a stir in the church. Men and women would rise spontaneously, but they would have long hours yet before them to say their prayers on their beads, to turn over again and again their sins in their memory before they went on their knees before the man of God. Generally speaking, women, of whom there would be more than men, would have to wait 2 or 3 days. The Abbé Vianney would confess them in the chapel of St. John the Baptist. If they did not want to lose their turn, they would either have to pay a placeholder or to spend the night hours in the belfry porch and the hours of the day in the church. It was only at meal times that they could keep their places by getting a number card. A man who wanted to confess to the saint in the evening would have to arrive early in the morning. No exceptions were made except for the sick or for people for whom it was materially impossible to wait. The Curé d'Ars had a supernatural intuition which enabled him to detect them, and he would often go and pick them out of the crowd himself. The village cafes, which had not been able to hold against the Abbé Vianney's denunciations, had been replaced by modest hostelries. There was the Hôtel Pertinard, and today the Hôtel de la Basilique, the Hôtel Blanc, and the Hôtel Robert, and the Hôtel de la Croix. the Hotel Notre Dame des Grès. It was possible to live there for a reasonable sum, for the proprietors did not hold the pilgrims to ransom. Pilgrims also boarded with private families. One day in 1858, a canon, who had vainly sought a bed in all the hotels, and at a number of private homes too, was overjoyed to end up by finding accommodations in the little house of the sisters, who kept a small shop for devotional articles not far from Providence. They supplied him with board and lodgings for 2 francs 50 cents a day, and I got good value for my money, he used to say with a smile. Even in the chilly nights of May, there would be as many as 50 or 60 pilgrims camping out all night in the fields round the village for lack of shelter. In August and September, even greater numbers would spend their nights in this way, waiting for the church doors to open. And we will continue reading this book next Sunday, and I'll try to post a few pictures of maybe the inside of the parish church or of St. John Vianney's room. So look for that on Instagram and Facebook. And thanks for listening to Miss Retro Reads.